Dr. Lachlan McIver. How the hell are you?
Good, Nico. Flattered to be joining virtually for this conversation that we've been plotting and scheming for so many months.
I know, and I've been really looking forward to this one, I have to say. It's a shame we couldn't meet in person because you're not that far away, an hour and a half drive or so. Down in Geneva.
Down in Geneva, just present but not very available at the moment, mate. Got a few things on.
Well, we'll get to that because I just don't know how you do these things. I don't know where you find the time. But Lachlan, as I said, is a doctor, obviously by the title. Author. He's just about to release a book which is called Life and Death Decisions, which I'm reading at the minute. And a musician, but primarily he's was a bush doctor back in Australia, which is a doctor of rural medicine. So you're basically, I don't know, how would you term a doctor of rural medicine? A jack of all trades. You learn to do everything.
That's definitely the philosophy. Yeah, the official term, if you like, is rural generalist. That's certainly how we refer to it in Australia, and that term's kind of catching on internationally. But there's lots of variations on that. Community doctor, family physician, rural GP. They're all sort of variations on the same theme. But in Australia, rural generalist means something quite specific, and it's someone who holds a fellowship with the Australian College of Rural and Remote Medicine usually, or something very similar to that. And is able to do a bit of everything up to a point. That's how we're trained.
And because of what you did back in Australia, you ended up working for the World Health Organization, which is obviously based in Geneva, and then the Medecins Sans Frontieres, which is the MSF, the doctors who go into war zones and I guess do their best to help out. And we'll come to that too. But I'm reading your book at the minute. You very kindly sent me a copy to get through. And I mean, what you do is something else, because a lot of people won't realize about Australia is, well, number one is how big it is. It's enormous, and it's effectively a desert, really. Most of it.
A lot of it is, yeah. A lot of the middle bit. Yeah.
I've never been there. What am I talking about? But in the north, in the very far north of Australia, it's tropical, and very, very close to Papua New Guinea, and then into the Pacific Islands. And so that's where you spent quite a lot of your time dealing with, I guess, the indigenous Australians. Most of the time those, and a bit like indigenous populations, most places in the world, suffering from the same kind of diseases that seems to be common throughout, which is, alcoholism, obesity, diabetes, chronic diseases, which ultimately are preventable, and it's quite a sad state of affairs. And by reading your book, it's quite remarkable that someone like yourself would devote their lives to living in, very remote places and doing their best to help out these people.
Well, it's kind of you to frame it that way, but as you might also have read, or if not, you're going to read in the book, I've also felt like a bit of an imposter for much of my career in not doing more, right? Not committing in the longer term to staying and living and working in those communities, because coming and going on a short-term basis is better than nothing. But the real difference can only be made when you work with communities in places like that, whether it's in the deserts or islands of Australia or small island developing states in the Pacific, anywhere else in the developing world. When you work with communities to actually put in place those preventive measures that stop people getting sick or injured in the first place. So, it's something that I'm passionate about and have devoted a lot of my time and work life to doing. But, I feel a bit fraudulent sitting here in Geneva and only engaged in that in a part-time way at present. You're very kind to put it like that.
Yeah, but in saying that, I'm talking about the early chapters of your life in your book, and from what I've heard about you from other sources as well, there's not many people. It seemed to me that there wasn't many people. In fact, that particular branch of the rural generalist, I think.
Rural generalist medicine, yeah.
Yeah, there was. Most people hadn't even heard that there was such a thing in Australia. So there's another thing I've been thinking about as well. it's, you know, when, like, I'm from the UK, and, you know, I live in Switzerland now. You often meet doctors from different countries, some of them very poor countries. We get quite a lot of African doctors, Indians from the subcontinent, et cetera, immigrants who come across. And I always wonder, obviously you're getting paid better, but it seems very selfish of us in the West to be taking the doctors that they so badly need.
Yeah, I mean, you've probably heard the term the brain drain. This is sort of the catch-all term to refer to this phenomenon, where from an individual perspective, you can absolutely understand in large part why a doctor from a developing country would, you know, seek better opportunities for professional development, income, work-life balance, overall quality of life in a more developed country. So there's that kind of the push factors, but the pull factors, where countries like Australia and the UK are sort of sucking doctors and nurses and other health professionals from countries where they are definitely needed, is pretty selfish in a way. Although, you know, there's obviously the argument that those health professionals are needed in the developed countries as well. But yeah, from a macro perspective, you would think, you know, surely there's a way to sort of make this a more sort of a fairer system and have health professionals more equitably distributed around the world. And yeah, as you would know or would be gathering from the book, that's a topic pretty close to my heart, and also something I've devoted quite a lot of my time and attention to trying to do, even on a very small scale in the Pacific region.
Yeah, because for all these things, and I definitely urge people to read this book, and it's been getting some quite incredible reviews. I've been reading myself, and it's just how difficult to get your head around what, in a civilized Western country such as Australia, you have. Well, I wouldn't even say pockets, kind of large swathes of territory which have, you know, you guys buzzing around in planes and helicopters doing clinics every few weeks. Or people walking to you from great distance to come and get treated. And it's for us here in very populated Europe, it seems very bizarre that there can be that much space.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that really broke my brain early on in my sort of, you know, medical school years and early career in Australia was that we had these communities, and like you say, they're not small in terms of their total number. Like a significant proportion of the Indigenous population in Australia live in rural and remote areas, and the more remote you go, the higher proportion of the population is Indigenous. And the what we refer to as the social determinants of health, so things like, you know, housing, employment, education, you know, food and water, that affect health, and you know, deficiencies in those determinants of health lead to poor health. They are really very surprisingly and scarily prevalent in remote Indigenous communities in Australia. And even by the time I was finishing med school and I travelled a bit of the world, you know, thought myself a pretty cosmopolitan kind of guy, I was shocked to see what kind of living conditions were present in some of these communities and what health problems were thus present there as well. It really felt, and you know, forgive me, this is kind of a glib cliche, but it was really sort of third world and the first world. And I was astonished to discover that these communities, these problems existed and were effectively invisible to the majority of the Australian population. And, you know, that was one of the key motivating factors for me to spend more time in those communities, train in rural and remote medicine, try and do my bit, because I felt, yeah, okay, there's a lot of need elsewhere in the world, but you've got to start here at home. Again, I realize I'm being hypocritical in this because I'm not still in Australia working in remote Indigenous communities. But yeah, it's a pretty shocking situation. Australia's not alone in that, by the way. But when you look at, say, the difference in terms of life expectancy and other health indicators between Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities in wealthy developed countries like Australia, first of all, there's not a lot of other countries with which to compare. New Zealand, Canada, the US come to mind. Australia kind of does worse, does the worst out of that lot in terms of the differences, the differentials, the gaps in life expectancy, health indicators, etc. So, yeah, there's a lot of certainly a lot of need and a lot of compulsion, say, to at least during my professional journey to try and do my bit to help rectify that situation.
Well, I've talked about this with another guest. He's from Zimbabwe. He's, so down in the south of Africa. And we were talking about how these indigenous populations have been around for, well certainly the Australian Aborigines. Well, we don't know how long they've been there for. They say 75,000 years, but we ultimately just don't know. And we were talking about how the diseases that seem to follow Western culture, I guess you'd call it, a Western way of life, they're common across all of these indigenous peoples. And so I wonder, because you're always having, in the book, you seem to be popular amongst the indigenous guys because you're there helping, deliver babies and fixing axe wounds and heads, etc., and a lot of that kind of thing. But do you ever speak to the older ones and ask them what if these kind of diseases, these chronic diseases, were prevalent beforehand? Because what we discussed before is that once they lose their connection to the land or nature, or however you want to say it, their health just goes into decline. And I just wondered if you got any feedback from the locals about that at all.
Yeah, well, just as a point of order, I don't know how popular I was in the places where I worked, but I think our work in most of those communities is generally appreciated. But yeah, what you're describing it's a relatively recent phenomenon, and it should be something that as a if you think there's such a thing as a global society, we should be a lot more concerned about. It's known as the epidemiological transition. And basically, there's this idea that as communities, as societies have evolved and developed over the course of human history, their physical activity and nutrition and work-life balance has stayed more or less steady until you get to the Industrial Revolution, essentially. And then with industrialization and mechanization comes this explosion in population size, economic growth and development, and that's not all beer and skittles from a health point of view. Things like air pollution didn't exist 200 years ago, apart from things like wildfires. So you get this sort of strange paradox of people becoming wealthier, generally speaking, at a societal level, and then healthier up to a point until you get to this tipping point where that wealth starts to be damaging through decreasing levels of physical activity, poorer nutrition, and the rise of chronic diseases. So from the perspective of a non-Indigenous Australian or someone like yourself from the UK, that evolution has happened over hundreds of years, right? For Indigenous communities in countries like Australia, that's happened in the space of a generation or two, because they've been living a pretty traditional lifestyle up until, point X, depending on which community you're talking about, where they are, and what kind of contact they've had with the sort of developed society in Australia. But it's certainly less than 100 years, most of them, and for many of them, less than 50 years. So you get this, as you were describing, a sort of a cultural and physical displacement, often combined with a loss of sort of traditional practice and lifestyle, particularly connection to country, traditional means of food gathering, lower levels of physical activity, exposure to poisons like alcohol and smoking. And it's this really cruel combination that leads to this explosion in chronic diseases, particularly cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, kidney disease, and cancers. And what that has led to is in Australia, for example, Indigenous people having basically as a population overall, it's a very heterogeneous group, having experienced a decrease in life expectancy in the 20th century. This is crazy. It's unprecedented. And that is replicated in other countries, other societies. And the cruel thing about it, particularly cruel, I think, is in this epidemiological transition, that is often coupled with exposure to some of the old world diseases, the leprosy and the syphilis and the tuberculosis and, tropical countries, things like malaria and other parasitic diseases. So they kind of got the double whammy. And then you add to that climate change, which is basically making all of that worse. And we're really living in. I don't mean to sound too sort of doom and gloom, but really living in a very worrying era for the evolution of global health. And there are some countries like Indigenous communities in Australia and Pacific Islands where you can see that very clearly right now, and it should be worrying many more people.
Mm. And well, you mentioned there the traditional ways of getting their food. So they had the nutrition. I mean, they obviously knew how to live off the land and maintain their nutrition levels, and didn't have the types of diseases what we see currently. But did leprosy exist back then? Is that something, going back pre-colonization and stuff? Was leprosy something that was rife back then as well?
Sure, yeah. So it's still present now, but it's I think I refer to it in the book as kind of a biblical old-timey disease.
I know.
It's been present for as long as we know. It's referred to in the Bible. I'm not a kind of religious scholar, but certainly been present for thousands of years. And it's just one of many infectious diseases that have, up until recently, represented the main causes of morbidity and mortality, illness and death in most communities around the world, until this more modern phenomenon of chronic diseases, and they're often referred to as lifestyle diseases. Because they're so clearly linked to things like smoking and low levels of exercise and poor nutrition. And so it's those communities where you have these overlapping phenomena that we're seeing this really unprecedented decrease in life expectancy. And I use the example of Nauru in the book because it's a sort of geographically distinct, sort of isolated society, and literally in the space of a couple of generations, they've seen a decrease in life expectancy, and this is unprecedented throughout modern human history, as far as I can tell, for any country or society untouched by civil war or HIV. There's emerging evidence now that the opioid epidemic, in particular in wealthy developed countries, is causing a slight decrease in life expectancy, but it's nothing like the dramatic drop off we're seeing in countries like Nauru.
Mm. So going to your book a little bit, one thing that strikes me about you is that you're a very busy person. You seem to be a bit of a go-getter, and what I like, obviously that's great. And how you find the time to write a book, I don't know. But it was very interesting when I read about your upbringing, because it sounded a bit, well, not like mine, but you had a great deal of freedom and a lot of time, helping out your parents and on the farm and all that kind of thing. And do you think that gave you the belief that you can actually do stuff, like you say, a jack of all trades doctor, because you knew how to, growing up on a farm, you learn how to do pretty much everything.
Well, I should have. But I'm ashamed to say that I really squandered most of the opportunities that I had to learn from, particularly my father, who really was a jack of all trades. That guy could do anything. I know that sounds just like proud son talking, but this guy kind of built our house and did all the maintenance on our cars and established a farm and flew planes, and race cars and played guitar. And he was a real wild man of the family. And I was exposed to many of those skills that Dad was using on a daily basis growing up, but I just didn't really have the inclination to really be alongside him, working and learning from him. I did what I had to do. I had to work pretty hard, but I was more sort of just sort of the labor. I wasn't the apprentice as much as I could have been. So I guess in a slightly more sort of detached way, I was maybe aware of the value of being broadly skilled, but as someone who's not particularly handy, I think my approach to that or application of that had to be more kind of theoretical or academic, because I was not going to be in there sort of sleeves rolled up and grease under the fingernails myself.
Mm. So, I mean, a bit like I draw a kind of certain parallel to myself. When I was young, I didn't really know what to do, and it's kind of wasting my time, so to speak. And then I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew that adventure was a part of it. So I went off and joined the army. And that's what I get. That's the vibe I get off yourself.
Yeah, no, the adventure thing is definitely something that has been a big part of my life for as long as I can remember. And my parents both definitely had their own spirit of adventure in their own ways. Got to give credit to my mum too. And from the earliest age that I can recall, I was always off exploring in the rainforest, or riding a little motorbike around the farm. Then going off on sort of all day mountain biking adventures when I was old enough to ride. And that thirst that it sounds like you can relate to for adventure, coupled with the fact that I really, really didn't enjoy med school, broadly speaking, I guess was the twin set of factors that compelled me to get out of the city, out to the bush, and was thus exposed to this type of rural generalist medicine, this jack of all trades practice that helped me finally see the light and go, okay, yeah, that's something that I could do as a doctor, because I don't want to be stuck in a big city hospital doing X specialty for the rest of my life. Look at that.
Well, I can see that. I try to avoid going to hospitals as much as possible, but no, I get that entirely. So, why did you decide to write a book?
Always been mildly literary minded, I would say. I was a pretty voracious reader when I was a kid, and always enjoyed writing, even to the point where in high school, I remember my English teacher and even the principal, I think at one stage, were saying, "Oh, you're good at English, and your maths and science is okay." I was like, "Screw you! Don't define me." But in retrospect, they're probably right. And how things kind of evolved was that once I started working as a doctor and I started dabbling in research, I had this avenue to write. And it was, obviously research by definition is original work. And I found that I actually quite liked the writing part. So one thing led to another. I ended up doing a PhD while I was in the Pacific, looking at the health impacts of climate change, working for the World Health Organization. And while I was passionate about the topic, everyone, well, I feel like that topic needs to be much more broadly understood, because if people, particularly politicians, understood the direct detrimental impacts of climate change on our health, our parents and grandparents' health, our children's health, that might be a more effective trigger to action rather than the dithering that seems to be the main approach that most of them taking at the moment. I digress. The act of writing the PhD thesis was quite enjoyable for me. I know that sounds really masochistic, but I did get a kick out of it. But I felt hemmed in by the discipline, right? I mean, my kind of predilection for the occasional flowery phrase, a bit of Baroque descriptions of things doesn't fit well in a scientific article that you got to, several of which need to bang together into a PhD thesis. So when I got to the end of that, I felt like I had a bit more, had more freedom to write. I just didn't quite know what the content would be, but I had this idea at the back of my mind that, as I was just saying, that the topic of the health impacts of climate change is very important, and basically no one was ever likely to read my PhD thesis, and very, very few more people likely to read the accompanying papers that we were publishing in medical and scientific journals. So I had this little kernel of an idea that I might like to write something sort of more available and accessible for a wider readership on that topic. And that was sort of marinating in the back of my brain until I went to South Sudan. And this was my first sort of field visit for Medecins Sans Frontieres. And don't want to spoil it for you if you haven't got to that part of the book, but I was in a pretty messy state, or had been prior to that mission. And going there and doing that work was hugely significant for me, because it's renewed my sense of purpose. It was a real sort of therapeutic experience. And with that healing came this new desire and interest in writing. So, I found myself scribbling poetry by the light of my head torch, sitting in my little mud hut, in the middle of the swamp at night. And when I got home and was really back on my feet from a mental health perspective, I reflected on that and wrote a piece about my experience in South Sudan. And then that, with some advice from some very experienced, distinguished people I'm proud to call friends, literary circles in Australia, and more practically from the lovely individual who is now my agent, they sort of encouraged me to keep going and to flesh that into a full-length book. So, yeah, I spent sort of a year and a half or so bashing away at that here at this very desk, sort of one day a week, and here we are.
Mm. I mean, I haven't got to that part of the book, and without spoiling anything, it seems to me that you had some sort of, did you say it was a mental health issue?
Had a breakdown, mate.
Oh, I had a breakdown. Okay.
Not gonna sugarcoat it. Yeah, I crashed and burned big time. Very humbling experience, as you can imagine. And if anyone out there listening to us waffling on has had that experience or feels like they might be having that experience, reach out. It's a dark and dangerous place. So there is help available. There's always people you can talk to. Don't be shy. Don't be timid. Talk to someone.
Yeah. Funnily enough, a friend of mine, he was on the podcast just a few episodes ago, talking about his alcoholism, and which was, a real alpha guy, a special forces soldier, British special forces. Just the drink got the better of him, and he, hit rock bottom and is bounced back up, and he's now got a mental health charity in Zimbabwe, et cetera, et cetera. So he's, he's done, like you say, hit rock. But this is what I find really interesting, is when people, high achievers, like yourself, like him, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a high achiever, but it's kind of a good example that it can happen to anyone. And so hitting the rock bottom, almost like it's a ritual or a passage of life. So you have to hit the lows to then come back up and improve yourself or something. It seems like a bloody, like a myth, one of these Greek myths that they always seem to have to do this horrible thing in order to come back out.
So I would not wish that experience on anyone, right? It's a horrible thing to go through. And I would really push back against the idea that, for someone to have a complete life experience, they need to have included that kind of crash and burn and scramble out of the pit again kind of experience. But I would say that having had that happen to me, or it's not something that passively happened to me, having been through that, it certainly has helped me know myself a lot better, understand where my limits are, which I think is kind of, that's the background context, this discussion, right? If you're someone who's doing a lot of things and pretty busy and pretty energetic and whatever, you can be a bit blind to that approaching the limits of what you can manage. So I was, kind of blithely just going along my merry way, thinking that I could basically do it all at once, until it all just, came crashing down around me, and I, caved into myself like a neutron star. So that humbling experience, and not just the caving in bit, but the blood and sweat, man, of getting out again. Not just doing the things from a sort of purely mental health point of view that you need to heal from a nasty bout of depression, the sleeping and the nutrition and the exercise and, avoiding alcohol and all the rest of it. But the addressing the root causes of what caused that cave in, that was just as horrible and took a lot longer. So, it has certainly made me a more aware and insightful person, I would say. But yeah, geez, I wouldn't want anyone to have to go through that if they can avoid it.
No, and I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't even know what the symptoms of a breakdown are, because actually both of my grandfathers had breakdowns, either during or roughly during or just after World War II. One with shell shock, and one was a farmer, and the stress of trying to produce food and etc. Because he wasn't allowed to go to war, obviously, because he's a farmer.
Wow.
And no one, it's a traditional kind of the Scottish way, or maybe the British way, that you just don't talk about mental health issues, or we didn't, certainly back then. But how does it manifest itself? When did you realize, or how? Yeah, just I don't have a clue.
Look, I feel, well, first of all, sorry to hear about your grandfathers, and that culture of not wanting to talk about it, not really recognizing it, not accepting it when you do recognize it in yourself. I don't think that's gotten a lot more sophisticated over time. I mean, mental health issues, certainly in like Aussie men, is something that is more accepted and more present in the public discourse these days. But that's a very recent phenomenon. So yeah, very happy to be talking to you about issues like this today, to be contributing to the broader acceptance of this as a topic that needs to be addressed. How do you recognize it? Look, I feel a bit silly, to be honest, a bit naive, because throughout my career as a doctor, I'd seen plenty of patients with depression, from very severe depression, kind of can't get out of bed, suicidal thoughts intruding on an hourly or daily basis. And I've managed patients, or tried my best to support patients who have then gone on to die by suicide. So I've seen that horrible, ugly end of the spectrum. In the book, there's a description of a very close friend of mine who died by suicide as well. And then I've also seen patients with, down the other end of the spectrum, sort of just at risk of or experiencing early symptoms of depression. So despite that experience, and despite my medical training, and despite however many symptoms and signs of depression I could rattle off on any given Sunday, I didn't recognize them in myself until quite late. So I don't want to be quoting directly from the book, but I belatedly realized that the reason I wasn't sleeping well or at all, had very low levels of energy, lost pleasure in doing the things that I usually enjoyed, was in a foul mood most of the time, and was chronically stressed. That's what my version of depression looked like. And I'm sure any person on the street hearing that list would go, "Guy's depressed." But yeah, it's hard to have that insight to see it in yourself.
I guess, probably a lot of people listening will listen to your list and see quite a few of those things on them for themselves. Because based on the fact that I have still a lot of friends who ex-military. There's a lot of them who suffered from shell. I don't even like to call it PTSD.
PTSD.
I call it shell shock.
Right.
Let's call it what it is.
Right. Yep.
And so it's affected. It hasn't really affected me. I don't think so, but I don't know. It's like you say, you can see it in other people, but you can't see it in yourself. That's I think that's probably a human trait. But so the people who, a lot of the guys who listen are that's their daily life effectively. They've been in that situation. But how did you go about treatment?
Well, just as a little aside, I respect your choice of terminology in the context of what you and your colleagues do and experience. It's really impossible for civilians to imagine. But I think the PTSD term is still very useful because it goes beyond just that sort of quite literal shell shock phenomenon to apply to people who experience other forms of trauma. In terms of how to treat it, that's really an individual.
I mean, for you.
Yeah. So once I eventually accepted what was happening, I took some pretty radical steps, man. Again, I don't want to spoil it for anyone who's going to read the book, but we're into the topic now. So basically, I was just a quivering mess incapable of making sensible decisions for myself, which, by the way, is one of the most disconcerting aspects of depression. It's when your thinking is so clouded and your decision-making abilities are so reduced that it's a very off-putting, destabilizing experience. So basically, on the instructions of my mother, used her credit card because I was broke, which is one of the factors I was contributing to the whole situation. Took the first flight home from Geneva to Australia and just bunkered down. So slept as much as my body would let me, ate as healthily as I could, as much, did as much exercise as I could. Went out for a run most days, avoided any kind of intoxicants, and equally, if not more importantly, saw my GP, got a referral to an excellent psychologist, and started the psychotherapy. And that included not only the sort of emergency physiological tools that you need to help stop the rumination and the sort of spirals of negative emotions that you experience, it's also exploring the contributing factors. So again, depression is different for everyone. And it ranges from being very circumstantial to very organic and chemical, and it's usually some kind of combination, right? And it is a lot more prevalent than most people think, right? You alluded to that a few moments ago. So anyone who's recognizing those symptoms that I'm mentioning, I would not be surprised if perhaps the majority of our listeners had experienced some of those at some time. It's just however the number you have at the same time that kind of equals the severity of the depression that you got. But for me, the GP, psychologist, plus sort of non-pharmacological measures were essential. And then, of course, we had a very sort of frank and detailed discussion between us, including with my mum and my sister, about whether I should go on antidepressants. That's also a very individual decision, right? You can't really generalize advice about that. At that point in time, we decided, obviously I had a key say in it, but apropos of the aforementioned not being real clear in my thinking, was guided by their advice. They look, okay, it doesn't seem like a trial of antidepressants is necessary or ideal for me at this time, but we'll definitely keep that option reserved. And as I was, clearly sort of healing, even though the root cause of the problem was still out there needing to be addressed, I was comfortable with that decision to knock on antidepressants at the time. But as you would be aware, depression is not something that goes away quickly or easily. It often recurs, and it's often sort of there in the background at a low level, just kind of waiting for a trigger, whether it's a new stress or whether it's being tired or having some other kind of sort of psychological low reserve. Having this sort of suppression in your ability to be mentally healthy, and then it resurges. But what I would go on to say is that I was aware, excuse me, even at the time I was experiencing this first major depressive episode, that there were emerging treatments really starting to make a big impact in the field of medicine, Western medicine, right? So in countries like, to some extent Australia, but particularly in the UK and the US, there's this explosion of interest and research into the role of psychedelics as aids to psychological and psychiatric therapy. This is not a new area of research, by the way. You and many of your readers, listeners may be aware that there was a lot of work on this in the 60s and 70s. But then, due to cynical and misguided politics, particularly out of America, that was really, really clamped down on throughout much of the sort of late 70s, throughout the 80s and into the 90s, because of the misclassification of psychedelics as Schedule I substances, incorrectly and very, very cynically. So there's these lost decades of research into medicines that have been described by prominent psychiatrists as having the same power for psychiatry as the microscope does for biology, the telescope does for astronomy. Like there's astonishingly powerful medicines. Tools allow us to sort of get a glimpse inside the mind and understand better its inner workings. There's functional MRI scans that show how neurons are connected when a person is under the influence of psychedelics. When you think about a lot of other chemicals, alcohol or medicines, that actually inhibit neuronal connections or, frankly, kill neurons. So I was sort of aware of this field of research emerging because, I'm a doctor and I've got a lot of friends as doctors, and we read journals and have a sense of what's happening out there. But having experienced this horrible episode of major depression and emerging from it, and having had this discussion with my GP and psychologist about, okay, well, is antidepressants something that I should be trying myself? I was curious enough, and I suppose bold enough to seek out independently exposure to psychedelic medicine myself. So that's a topic we can go on to discuss if you feel the time is right.
Well, yeah, because it's one of the things I read about. In fact, I read quite a lot about this sort of stuff because I found it so fascinating that ecstasy, MDMA, and ketamine, both party drugs when we were young, are now being used to treat PTSD and depression and late stage terminal patients, and that's been 40, 50 years almost that's 40, 50 years worth of research or potential research lost, and how much benefit it can have.
Yeah, so look, MDMA and ketamine are different to the sort of classical psychedelics, but they definitely have a role in treating different forms of mental health disorders. That's for sure. It's established, and that field of research is growing. But what I was particularly interested in, both from a sort of intellectual and professional perspective, but also from a personal perspective, was what the let's say the true psychedelics, so DMT, psilocybin, and mescaline, what the research was showing us about their potential as therapies for different types of psychological disorders. So despite those lost decades, the sort of political factors contributed to the suppression of research, the removal of funding, and this delay in development for this research, it has picked up in the last couple of decades, and in particular, I'd say the last 10 or 15 years. So there are researchers, not just in the US and the UK, but particularly in South America, where, Latin America, where a lot of these substances come from originally. Researchers in Brazil have been demonstrating for some time that in particular ayahuasca, which is a kind of a witch's brew, combining a couple of different plants in the Amazon that when prepared in this particular way, release DMT, which is probably fair to say the single most powerful psychedelic molecule known to man at this point.
Which we have in our brains as well. Our bodies produce it naturally.
Naturally occurring neurochemical. That's right. And I'm not an expert on the neurochemistry or sort of neuroscience of it all, but the particular concoction that releases DMT through the consumption of ayahuasca is sort of fairly widely recognized as being the most powerful psychedelic and entheogen known to humankind. Entheogen being a substance that basically connects the person taking it to the universe. So we should be clear about the fact that this medical research on these topics is pretty recent in the last few decades, right? But traditional societies who are the custodians of these medicines, known about it for thousands of years, understand them very well indeed. So it's really just the emergence of interest, use, and scientific evidence around the role of these molecules that is the recent kind of phenomenon. And so what I was observing in the the medical literature, and reading about in fantastic books. There's this, I haven't got it right here, but there's a fantastic book called How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. Subtitle is The New Science of Psychedelics.
It's on Netflix
Does an
right
excellent
now.
job.
It's on Netflix right now.
That's right. Yeah. So look, he writes extremely well and researches extremely well. He does a great job in this book and in the Netflix series of sort of summarizing the history, the science, the cultural practice, and the modern application of psychedelics in medicine. And so there's sort of this groundswell of interest on the topic, and being in Europe, the access to psychedelic therapies is far greater than it is, say, for example, in Australia at the moment. So, long story short, when I was sort of getting back on track following this major depressive episode, and to come home from South Sudan, feeling a lot healthier and stronger mentally, I felt that I was sort of in a position and robust enough to be able to go and seek out one of these encounters with psychedelic medicine, and was absolutely astonished at how effective it was for me. So I just want to make a massive disclaimer here that I'm not in any sense of the word recommending this to people. I'm just describing my own personal journey, and anyone interested in this topic should be talking to their doctor, their psychologist, their treating health professionals about it, right? Just really clear about that. But for people who do, through whatever route, have this encounter with psychedelic medicines, the scientific evidence is very compelling about their therapeutic benefit for different conditions: depression, suicidality, PTSD, different types of addiction disorders, including alcoholism, including smoking, as well as, very complex conditions, let's say, like end-of-life anxiety. So people with terminal diagnosis who are dealing with the end being nigh. So, my first encounter with ayahuasca and the subsequent encounters that I've had have been radically effective in not just sort of making me feel more healthy from a mental health perspective, but improving my overall mental health, and feeling like I have a more sort of comprehensive understanding of who I am and how I fit into society and what my sort of place is in the world. So, it's difficult to describe. That's one of the classic properties of psychedelics, is their ineffability. But I feel I have some sense of responsibility as a doctor trained in Western medicine, who has experienced depression and who has experienced psychedelics, to just add my kind of 2 cents to the discussion about the potential role that these have in our society.
Well, they do say that people receive a calling towards ayahuasca. Now that's going to sound a little bit woo, a bit airy-fairy, but it seems a good enough reason as any. If you don't feel like you want to do it, don't do it. If you feel like you want to do it, I guess you want to do it, right? And for the reasons, I think you. In fact, I was in Costa Rica last year, and very close to where we were staying was a pretty famous ayahuasca clinic. I'd never heard of it, but apparently it's pretty famous and staggeringly expensive as well. It was for wealthy North Americans or whoever, I suppose. But they were treating. They've been doing that for quite a long time as well, when it was still kind of underground, but it was okay in Costa Rica, I suppose, because they've got the jungle culture, I suppose you could say. I don't know, jungle medicine maybe. But they were using people, and a guy I spoke to, and the last person in the world you'd expect to do ayahuasca, was a very heavy drinker, loved drinking, didn't feel like it was a problem at all, and heavy smoker, went and did it, and he hasn't smoked or drank since. And he was a kind of let's say mid to late 50s, not in terrible shape. He was a little bit overweight, but looked actually, there's sometimes you see an alcoholic and they've got that kind of like shine to them. I know it's a whiskey shine, we call it, but he had that kind of look about him cirrhosis. Before he went.
Cirrhosis.
It's called cirrhosis, but they kind of look almost quite healthy. Wasn't too red in the face. Anyway, I think you know what I mean. And he quit it. Absolutely, he kicked it, and he was on a bottle of spirits a day.
Well, I mean, a couple of things to mention on that. First is that in sort of responding to that calling and going to an encounter with psychedelic medicine like ayahuasca, it is recommended to have some kind of intention, so that there is something sort of a little bit in the center of your mind that then when you are one with infinity throughout your psychedelic journey, that is then able to spark the kinds of revelations and insights and epiphanies that these medicines are very, very well recognized as being able to do. But then there are also these sort of secondary, subconscious, subliminal kinds of intentions that may be in the background that you're by definition not as aware of. So this is my way of saying that having experienced ayahuasca myself, I also am less interested in alcohol, drinking less, being more conscious about what I eat, particularly avoiding animals to a large extent, and because you just feel more connected to nature and to other living beings, and then to the universe. And I'm sounding pretty hippie here, but it's that's how it is.
No, but not at all. I would just say that alcohol and nicotine are legal, which are both cancerous depressants. Well, no, actually nicotine's not, but alcohol is a depressant. They're fine, but anything that opens your mind or could expand your point of view, your consciousness, that kind of thing, were forbidden for decades.
I mean, I'm a bit bloody cynical and pessimistic about some things, but I would like to believe that this renaissance that is very clearly occurring with respect to psychedelic medicines will lead to, in the not too distant future, some evidence-based sort of regulatory support for the use of these medicines, because their potential benefit as therapies is really difficult to overstate. It's profound, yeah. And they're sort of different countries and sort of regulatory bodies are in different places about this, right? So we're in my wife and I were in Ecuador last year, and this is one of the homes of ayahuasca, and it's not just tolerated, it's actively promoted by the Ministry of Health. It's sort of glossy magazines on the airplanes that have ads for a resort and a golf course and an ayahuasca retreat. It's out there, openly accepted, encouraged, respected, all the rest of it. So the US and the UK, to give credit where credit's due, are really doing very significant work alongside Brazil in establishing this scientific evidence basis for the subsequent studies and the policy discussions and the regulatory changes that would be required for us to get to the next level in terms of availability and appropriate use of these medicines. And really, really respect the work that's been done by, say, John Hopkins University Group in the US and Imperial College in the UK, who are doing really rigorous research under the best possible sort of scientific conditions to study these effects, so that we can be more medical, quite frankly, about the use of these medicines, rather than being sort of these tolerated retreats where there's a combination of ideally shaman with a psychologist, psychotherapist. That tends to be the best kind of access that you can have to these medicines at the moment. I think we don't want to over medicalize that model, because a lot of it is about, as you would be aware from your readings on psychedelics, it's about set and setting. You don't want to be kind of, in a hospital bed having an ayahuasca experience, right? That would definitely not be ideal. But if we can complement the current sort of best practice approach to sort of shore it up with some medical evidence and support, that I think would be what we should be looking to achieve in the next few years, ideally.
I can't wait to finish this book. I love this subject. I find it very fascinating as well. And for you, I guess the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And what was your takeaway
from the ayahuasca experience?
Yeah.
You mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, that I cannot imagine any other type of medicine that could have given me that kind of total system reset that ayahuasca gave me. It is really amazing how powerful the experience can be in terms of improving. Well, how powerful and profound I found the experience to be in improving my mood, enabling me to see more clearly and understand the sort of the causes, the determinants of my depression, and then go beyond that to sort of see and understand things in my life that could or should be addressed to be able to enable me to live a more considered, compassionate life as I wanted to do. So forgive me for saying this, because I know it's going to sound pretty hyperbolic, but it has made me a better person.
Well, that's what I mean. There's the proof. If you feel it's made you a better person, then it's had a good effect.
I'm not perfect. still do pretty dopey things sometimes. And it's not that I've become some sort of guru who understands everything about the world and humanity and the rest of it. But I will say this, Nicole, I'm quite certain that had I not had that encounter with psychedelics, there would be no book. There would be no album. Those neuronal connections that psychedelics can make, I feel have definitely been made in my brain.
Yeah. So talk about that a minute, because I didn't realize were you making the album with our mutual friend, or is that something you did on your own?
Yeah. So our buddy, very talented, intelligent, multi-instrumentalist that he is.
Shout out.
He and I played. Hey, Rob. He and I played briefly in a band in the basement in the early days of lockdown, with a couple of other talented friends as well. But obviously, as the lockdown restrictions became more restrictive, we had to kind of disband, pun intended. And during that hiatus, when I think, speaking for myself, I thought we'd eventually kind of be able to get together again. But our musical journeys evolved, and we ended up sort of, I don't want to say splitting up, but working on things independently. So, Rob and Lizzie, our wonderful singer, who's also a great pianist and now songwriter, ended up doing their own thing. Shout out to Faux Naive. Check him out on Spotify. And I ended up just sort of fooling around in the basement myself with the gear, very modest gear I had down there, and just putting the layers of the tracks together myself. So I didn't start out thinking I was going to create a solo album, but that's kind of what happened. So my alter ego is The Serpent's Nest, and I got my debut album on Spotify, a couple of clips on YouTube, and that has been a really, really fascinating and very pleasurable and rewarding experience. Doing it for nothing, like the idea of playing live with a band at some stage is still something that I would like to do, but basically it's just a little passion project, and it's enabling me to really plumb the depths of my punk rock side and apply the poetry that I've always loved and enjoy writing to actually be be a songwriting process, which is really cool. I'm not very skilled, basically playing the guitar and bass and piano with the same level of skill that I had when I stopped taking lessons at the age of 16 or whatever. But yeah, I guess there was enough bloody muscle memory lying dormant for all those years, that coupled with this sort of, the cattle prod to the brain that came with the ayahuasca, that it's really inspired this creative output that I never imagined I would be able to do.
So you did a Dave Grohl. So when Nirvana broke up, he went into his garage and wrote the first Foo Fighters album, and he did everything by himself. I'm
very, very, very flattered by the comparison, and I'm pretty terrible on the drums, so I use a program for that. But the rest I fool around with the guitar and bass and keyboard, and surprised myself by even having a bit of a sing. So it's not the kind of music that would be to everyone's taste. But if anyone wants to check out Serpent's Nest, you'll give your ears a good time with some basement punk rock.
Nice. And is that the title of your band, we'll call it? Is that a reference to something you might have seen on ayahuasca by any chance?
It's a good question, and I have deliberately designed the album cover. The album's called The End of the Beginning of the End, which sort of indicates the slightly apocalyptic vibe of the album. I've deliberately designed the album cover to have a bit of a psychedelic vibe. But no, the Serpent's Nest it refers to a couple of things. It refers to a phrase that I use in the book in reference to a very, very complex ethical dilemma that I was involved in early in my career. It's just sort of this serpent's nest of ethical questions that arose in the treatment of this patient. And then it also, I don't know whether you describe it as coincidence or not, it also refers more literally to a painting I have in the basement, which was painted by one of my patients, a very well-respected Indigenous artist from the Central Desert in Australia. And that painting is of an actual serpent's nest, snakes popping out of their eggs in the nest, encircled by a parent snake or two. And I bought that painting from just a patient, but also an artist. The artist often used to come into the emergency department to offer their paintings for sale. So it was a real privilege for me to be able to purchase this painting from a lady I knew and had treated. And I bought the painting specifically because I've always been scared of snakes. As an Australian, I think there's a bit of logic to that. I guess I sort of bought the painting to deliberately sort of provoke myself and my fears. And it's down in the basement. And when it came time to come up with an artist name for this solo project I was working on, painting was right there. So the name was there for the taking.
Well, it's funny you say that. I wouldn't say it's it's an irrational fear, I would say, of sharks, which is one of the reasons I started surfing. And when I was reading your book, and reading your book, and again, in Australia, especially when you're in Western Australia, there's a lot of big sharks. And you tell us a story about a 14-year-old girl who gets one of her legs and hips and half of her pelvis bitten off by a great white. What did that look like?
Well, with the greatest respect to the patient, it looked like a horror show. Trauma, this is just a particularly dramatic form of trauma, is terrible to witness. So, whether someone has been in a car crash or run over by a tractor or fell off a building or lost their arm to a drill bit or has, had a hind quarter amputation from a great white bite, it's horrifying. And as one of the health professionals involved in treating those patients, trying to save their lives, whether you're an ambulance officer or a nurse or a surgeon or a doctor in the emergency department, which is where I usually encounter them, it is this weird kind of sort of detachment that you have to do between dealing with the horror of what you're seeing and cracking on with the job you have to do. Yeah, it's wild.
Well, I mean, I won't give the story away, but it doesn't have a bad ending, shall we say? But yeah, for that one, it makes it a little bit more kind of visceral, the fear, when it's not something mechanical. It's an accident. It's actually you're out there having a surf with your friends, and next thing you know, you've been attacked by a great white shark. And also, it was interesting, the story, it said her friends, and she was only 14, so they must have been quite young. They went and fought that shark off and got her back to the shore. That is unbelievable.
Look, I'm not a surfer. I grew up in the northeast of Australia, Great Barrier Reef's right there, no waves. That's my excuse for being basically a disgrace to my nation, not surfing. But surfers, I think, are really hardcore. I would, really respect the surfer sort of philosophy and community. I think it'd be a beautiful sport to do. You're out there on the ocean, either with the waves or with your mates or both, and the dolphin turns up and whatever. Maybe I'm over romanticizing it a little bit. But they're fit buggers and it looks like a lot of fun. But if you're a surfer and you're surfing somewhere where there's great white sharks, I don't think that fear is irrational at all. It's as scary as all get out.
You can't really think of anything worse.
Yeah. But when you crash up against the rocks or getting bloody scraped across the coral or be dragged underwater for minutes on end, surfing is a hardcore sport, man.
It sure is. I'm very conscious of the fact that you're a very, very busy man. And we didn't really talk about your book so much, but I think we actually, by not talking about the book, we actually covered a lot about the book based on your...
That's true.
Our little diversion into the psychedelic side of things. But, for me, I love talking about that kind of stuff, and it looked like you did too. Is there anything you want to say about the book before I let you get back to your job?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, firstly, thanks for being gracious enough to let me give it a little plug. I've got the 2 editions here, just in case, right, for anyone that's watching us on YouTube later. So we've got the Australia-New Zealand edition here, the UK kind of most of the rest of the world edition here. They're both available for sale now. They'll be officially released into the wild the first week of September. There are some bookstores that are already stocking them, including here in Geneva at Pay or Rive Gauche. You can order online, Amazon, or through your local bookshop. Support local bookstores where you can. And strap yourself in, guys. It's a wild ride. I hope anyone who takes the time to read it enjoys it, and maybe even learn something from it.
I'm about just over halfway through, and it is as you say, a wild ride. It's pretty nuts what you guys had to do. And I also heard that there was a bit of a bidding war for the rights to this book. Is that true, or is that something that has been blown out of proportion?
No, I mean, it's true to say. Yeah, I don't want to seem immodest or unprofessional, but it's certainly on the Australian side. There was, let's say, strong interest from a number of publishers who proved to have highly acquisitive approach to the book and the purchase of the rights to publish it. So I'm thrilled with the publisher that I have in Australia called Ultimo Press, part of the Hardy Grant Group, and Octopus Publishing Group in the UK, part of Hachette. Delighted with the outcomes, and I was really also delighted and very flattered and humbled by the level of interest on the part of the publishers, particularly on the Australian side. It blew my mind. So hopefully the book will prove as popular to the reading public as the publishers are betting it's going to be.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I wish you all the best of success, and I'm very pleased that you came on my podcast first, because I'm pretty sure that you're going to be appearing on much more popular ones than mine. But it's nice to get on the ground floor for this one. But it's been a real pleasure to speak to you. I love that kind of talk. The more esoteric, the better. Sometimes it's great. Is there anything you want to? Do you have any websites or social media things you want to publicize? before we go?
Very nice of you to offer. So, look, information about the book and my music and a bit about me for anyone who's curious is on my website. So it's just drlachlanmciver.com, drlachlanmciver.com. That includes information about the tour dates for the book. So I've got a tour coming up in Australia in September, and then there'll be a Geneva launch event on the 7th of October. So it's welcome to check out those dates, venues, and relevant info. Also, if anyone's reading the book, I'd be very grateful if you maybe dropped a little review on Goodreads. And yeah, feel free to follow my shenanigans on Facebook, Dr. Lachlan McIver -writer, or on Twitter, Lachlan_McIver. Thanks for the chat, Nicole, and for the opportunity to do a bit of shameless self-promotion.
No, that's the whole point. That's one of the reasons I wanted to get you on. And October 8th, did you say, in Geneva?
Friday, 7th of October at from 5:30 to 7. There's the official launch/book signing at Pale Rive Gauche. I think it's the largest bookstore in Geneva, certainly the one with the largest English language section.
I know it well.
And yeah, I'll be there signing books and giving a little reading and have a bit of a Q&A. So yeah, you and any of your buddies, any of our listeners are welcome.
I will come. If that's all right.
Awesome, man. Great to see you there. Yeah. We'll go for a drink afterwards.
Oh yeah, it sounds even better. We'll get some alcohol-free beers in.
Fantastic. That'd be the plan.
All right, Lachlan. Thank you so much for coming on. Lachlan McIver, great guy. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nicole. See you soon. Thanks, Nicole. See you soon. Bye-bye.